Hey, what's up guys, Grace here with some more Anthem stuff, and today I want to bring you guys my impressions of the 4 Javelins in the game, especially now since we've got to experience the 2 demos, playing for dozens of hours and gearing them all up with probably the best items available. I made a video about this topic about a month ago or so, but now that we've got the chance to experience what Anthem has to offer in terms of classes, I think it is time to revisit that with a fresh twist. So today I'm going to bring you guys an overview of all of the 4 Javelins strengths and weaknesses, what playstyles suit them the best, and towards the end of the video, how I ended up ranking them up against one another. So if you enjoyed that, a thumbs up would be super appreciated, and let's get started with the Ranger since he's also the first one you get to play in the beginning of the game. In terms of strengths, I found the Ranger's biggest quality the fact that it's a perfect middle ground between all of the other Javelins, borrowing some of the characteristics that make the others strong, which also makes it a very good beginner-friendly pick. Now I see why BioWare decided to make this a starter Javelin. It is definitely very adaptable. It's one of the more agile Javelins right after the Interceptor. It has a decent HP pool to survive for longer. Its arsenal provides high damage abilities as well as good set of primers and detonators that provide most of the status effects in the game, with the exception of course the acid attacks. We have access to freeze and fire effects just from the frost and inferno grenades, electric from the low cooldown melee attacks, and there are several high damaging detonators like for example the Seeking Missile that can detonate not only your abilities but also that of your party members. The Ranger's playstyle fits the role of the all-around adaptable soldier with plenty of tools to take down any enemy type. You have access to powerful grenades, rockets, laser beams, and all around an amazing set of support abilities. Your ultimate is also good against big waves and decent enough against enemy bosses, and in combat you can take advantage of both of your agility moves while on the ground, as well as your good all-around flight duration for a better positioning. Other Javelins cannot do both of these good at the same time. They are either excelling in one or the other, but not in both. Your support abilities are also probably some of the best in the game, with Bulwark Point providing probably the best bullet deflection method with its spherical shield that covers all of your sides. Then Muster Point, which is the second ability in the support slot, provides an all-around increased damage for everybody who stays inside of it. So as you can see, the Ranger is both a good party buff and a damage mitigator. This versatility is what makes the Ranger so good and such an amazing early on and even end game pick, and it does it very good to the point that you'd never feel lacking in any of these areas. But that is also probably one of its biggest weaknesses. This versatility comes at the cost of not excelling in anything. Yes, it can do some pretty good AoE damage, but the Storm can do it much better, and his initial HP pool advantage gets mitigated fast enough, and even more so at high levels when gear provides plenty of HP and defenses anyway. His ultimate, while not the weakest of the bunch, is mostly suited for groups of trash mobs, but otherwise against big bosses it provides mediocre damage at best. I'd also argue that for those who are looking for a thrill and to create more crazy builds, the Ranger is not going to be capable of doing any of this, and it might even get boring after a while. Being a safe pick is also what makes it uninteresting for some, so I wanted to bring that up for you. Now moving on to the mighty Colossus, this is the second Javelin that was ever revealed. Everything about it is about sheer size and raw power. Its biggest strength comes from its massive HP pool that can be further increased with some very powerful Colossus specific components. He's also the only one that has access to heavy weapons, such as for example the grenade launchers or the miniguns, which are some of the highest damage dealing weapons in the game after a certain sniper rifle. He also possesses a very good shield that replaces the dodge mechanic that other Javelins have, which is also on a very low cooldown, and it can protect you from bullets, spells, and even explosions. Additionally, you can equip it while flying and even use it to knock down the enemies as long as they are of a regular size, making it a very good crowd controlling ability. The melee attack is also particularly strong, probably one of the best in the game, being a huge ground slam with a 360-degree radius that also detonates all of the primed enemies in the area. Also, let's not forget about his Siege Cannon ultimate ability, which is an amazing both single target and AoE attack all combined into one. one, so it's absolutely devastating. It looks amazing, it's almost like a mini nuclear detonation. His abilities are also rather diverse, having access to mortars, cannons, flamethrowers, railguns, electric coils, and even an acid spitter that lets him apply fire, acid, and electric debuffs, so he's all around a very good debuff provider. Now in terms of weaknesses, there's a few of them, particularly the ones that cause a lot of people to think the Colossus is underpowered. It's by no means underpowered, but there are a few things you need to keep in mind when playing it. First, the Colossus has no energy shield that he can regenerate in combat, neither does he have a dodge, which means he can't simply disengage from the enemy as easy as other classes do. He's forced to stay on the front lines for much longer, and he needs to take advantage of his huge HP pool, angling that shield against incoming damage, as well as using his crowd control and damage abilities to knock out targets, otherwise he won't have any HP pots to pick up, and since he can't regenerate, this also makes him, well, quite a prime target to get downed, and this is where I think most of the people had trouble with this class. Second of all, he's also very slow, which is most noticeable on the ground. This means that if you got used to dodging with the other classes and then later on pick up the Colossus, you might find it hard to adapt with the playstyle. Finally, most of his abilities require you to drop down your shield to use them, which means that you are overexposing yourself. This, combined with the overextending in the enemy lines, will get you down very fast, and there's no way for you to regenerate in combat unless you're killing your enemies first. Other Javelins don't have this problem since they can quickly disengage, dodge, and otherwise just regenerate their shield as soon as they exit combat. But moving on to the next one, we have the Interceptor. By far the biggest strength I found for the Interceptor to have is his amazing agility. Despite being up in enemies' faces almost constantly, I found my survivability with the Interceptor to be extremely high. You can pretty much dash and dodge around the clock, having the most amount of dodges and dashes of all of the Javelins in the game, which means that the enemy barely touches you, unless of course it does an AoE damage ability or you're not being careful enough. Your melee attacks are also high damage, higher than any equipable gun in there, and you can both stagger enemies and detonate them if they have primers. It's also noteworthy that you're the only one who has a debuff aura, which means that you can freely spread the debuffs to all of the other enemies without worrying about casting abilities. Ability wise, most attacks are single target, and you can even have target beacons to place on the enemies, including bosses, to deal additional damage, and that one is definitely noticeable, especially the one in the support slot. You simply cast Z once, put it on the enemy, and you will see an immediate effect on your overall damage. In fact, the Interceptor is one of the best in terms of single target sustained DPS, and I said sustained DPS, not burst DPS by the way. There's also some very cool skills in his arsenal, like the Spark Dash that lets you charge to the enemy, as well as various other means to apply frost and acid debuffs and spread them to all of the others around that area. His ultimate is also arguably the longest lasting, and since Javelins are invincible during their ultimates, this means that you are pretty much immune to all damage for extended periods of time, even in burning phases. Now in terms of weaknesses, I was talking about single target damage, which is of course also a great weakness in itself. The Interceptor doesn't particularly excel in any AoE damage at all, which means he pretty much moves from one target to another, or at the very least a small group to another small group. In a game where 90% of the fights are against huge groups of enemies, well, AoE is preferred rather than single target, since he's also in the enemy's face all day. That might put him in serious trouble, especially against big bosses that can do huge AoE damage, like for example the Tyrant's body slam that pretty much destroys everything underneath him. His status effect spread is also one of the weakest, if not the weakest, of the bunch, and generally speaking all of the other three classes are much better than the Interceptor at spreading debuffs and doing combo detonations. In fact, all of the classes he has access to the least amount of status effects, with only two of course being acid and frost. Meanwhile every other Javelin has access to about 3. Finally, his ultimate is also largely unimpressive and sometimes even useless against certain types of enemies, enemies, especially the ones that are flying or are on an elevated location. For example, in the Tyrant Mine boss encounter, you cannot hit the weak points with your ultimate since those are elevated compared to your position. You also cannot fly during the ultimate, and you can't use abilities, so you're pretty much at a great disadvantage during them by the fact that you're losing a lot of DPS from not hitting weak points. Finally, let's talk about the Storm. It goes without saying that in most RPGs out there, the mage type class is always very powerful, and Anthem makes no exception. Among its highest strengths, the Storm has the ability to spread the best 3 status effects in the game, which are fire, ice and electricity. In fact, of all of the 4 Javelins, he has access to the highest amount of primers and detonators, and with Anthem being all about those combo bonus damages, this means that he's going to be clearing any pack of enemy with utmost ease. His class specific abilities lets him further spread that effect to other enemies around the prime target, which means he's absolutely a beast against large groups of enemies. Most of his abilities are both good for massive AoE as well as single target damage. The ultimate is probably the highest damage dealer in the game right now, as it also provides detonators itself without relying on any other spell in the game. The Storm is also the only one that can stay up in the sky for the longest, which means he has a superior aerial advantage that no other Javelin has. Furthermore, by simply staying up in the air, his kinetic shield bubble gets buffed and ends up absorbing even more damage because of this compared to if he just stays on the ground. The Storm simply feels like an almighty god looking down on his enemies before annihilating everything in sight, and that's what makes him so badass. But that doesn't mean he has no weaknesses. The first one, of course, comes in the form of generally long cooldowns for some of the stronger abilities he possesses. Lightning Strike, for example, Glacial Spear and other similar high damage detonators are on a rather long cooldown for at least 10 seconds, sometimes even 15 or 20. Also, since he's using elemental abilities against high level targets with certain status resistances, he might have trouble dealing damage depending on the spells he is using. So for example, if an enemy is frost resistant, his frost attacks are obviously going to be pretty much useless. In fact, even at low levels, he cannot use half of what makes him useful, which is his ability to prime targets, until he takes down the blue shields of the target. In case you didn't know this, you cannot prime a target unless you take down his shield, so yeah, there's a disadvantage in this regard as well. His movement speed and overall agility isn't great either, being the second slowest after the Colossus. His HP pool also doesn't start that great, being among the weakest of the bunch, and finally I'd also argue that his support skills are rather weak. His wind wall is much worse than the ranger's bulwark point, and his cooldown reduction ability is barely even noticeable, as it only provides a 20% cooldown reduction to whoever stays in that circle. So yeah, most other Javelins in the game have much better support abilities than the Storm. But with that being said and done, I know you've all been waiting for the moment for me to rank them against one another and to see which one of them is the best. Now keep in mind that this is just my opinion and this applies only to what we had to experience so far, but at number 4 I'm going to have to pick the Interceptor, as it's the least useful in terms of co-op gameplay. He simply doesn't bring enough to the table that even a second ranger couldn't. Single target damage isn't really a big deal in a game where you constantly fight huge hordes of enemies, and his ultimate is almost useless against the fight in the stronghold, and most of the stronghold encounters are going to be this way, so yeah, he's pretty bad against those types of encounters, which is why he's on the 4th spot. At number 3 I've put the ranger very close behind the Colossus, and the only reason the Colossus ranks higher than the ranger is because of a certain build that is currently very good for him. This brings me to the Colossus on the number 2 spot for his flamethrower and lightning coil ability build, which is absolutely devastating against any groups of enemies. His ultimate is also top tier, dealing massive damage, both AoE and single target, and he can quickly bring that up with his broken build, so yeah, naturally he had to come at number 2. But on the 1st spot is of course the only one remaining, and that is the Storm. His excellent AoE and single target damage with the best aerial advantage in the game is simply unmatched. I never had problems fighting anything with the Storm, and it was super easy for me to destroy literally any other type of enemy in the game. I've even soloed the Tyrant Mine boss in the last few minutes when my entire party wiped, and that just tells you how much OP this class is right now. But this doesn't mean that only a couple of them are viable in endgame. All of the Javelins are most probably going to be viable at high levels and probably on the highest difficulty, but it's just undeniable that some some of them are much stronger than the others and have a better arsenal of abilities. But tell me below if you agree or disagree with my list. As always, if you enjoyed this video, a like would be super appreciated. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys later, so peace.